Welcome to PRI's podcast. I'm your host, Rowena Itchon. In this episode, we talk about drugs, specifically drug pricing. Everyone knows that government is so deep into healthcare that many of its complicated morass of regulations and programs often end up not helping the people they were intended to serve. Today's episode is about one such program, the 340B drug pricing program. It was designed to help low-income people get the drugs they need. But now, after more than 25 years of existence, it's morphed into a program that's incentivized hospitals to provide low-cost drug prices to those who don't even need the discounts, and distorts and complicates the healthcare market even more. My colleague Tim Anaya, PRI's Director of Communications, and I talked with Wayne Winegarden, PRI's Senior Fellow in Business and Economics, about the 340B program. He has a new brief that details the many pitfalls of the program, and it will be available on our website at pacificresearch.org. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to PRI's podcast, Wayne.
Thanks for having me, Ro.
Wayne, you've just released a new study exploring the 340B program, which might sound obscure to our listeners, but in reality, it could affect anyone who has used prescription drugs or will need prescription drugs in the future. So in a nutshell, what is a 340B program and how does it work?
The 340B program is a typical government way of trying to solve a problem, right? So it creates a large bureaucracy to create very indirect pathways to help the people they're trying to help. So in this case, we're talking about a drug discount program that it's intended to help low-income, uninsured patients, but they do this through giving discounts to hospitals or other providers that are known as covered entities.
Wayne, after reading your study, it sounds like the 340B program is really just another well-meaning government program. It's designed to help the poor, but it's really just being abused for profit. Can you describe some of the findings of your study and some examples of the current abuse in the program?
Oh, absolutely. And that's exactly right what's happening with the program. You have manufacturers who participate in the program because if you don't sell drugs at a discount to these covered entities, then you can't sell drugs to Medicaid. Obviously, that's such a large program that you have to participate in 340B. And what 340B does is that originally there was about 50 hospitals that participated back in 1992. Now, 1/3 of all hospitals are designated 340B hospitals, and about 8% of all outpatient drugs are sold through the program. So here's a program that's supposed to be targeting a small set of people who are vulnerable, may not be able to afford the drugs that they need. So it's supposed to be a niche program, and 1/3 of all hospitals and about 10% almost of all drugs are now going through this sales channel.
So one of the things that you write about in your study is that the 340B program encourages hospitals to prioritize serving well-off people. How is the needy being shortchanged in this case?
Well, and that comes from kind of the indirect nature that I was talking about earlier of the program. We're trying to help poor people or low-income people who don't have insurance. But instead of attaching the discount to those population we're trying to help, we've attached it to these institutions. So you have an institution that can be qualified to get a discounted drug. And then while we regulate the prices that the hospitals will purchase the drugs, you can think of it as the wholesale price, but we have absolutely no regulation on when they sell the drug, what price that should be. And so what happens is if you have an institution that has a large number of disproportionate or low-income people that are being served, but lots of people with well-paying insurance are also served. You can sell the drug to any of those patients, but when you sell it to the patients that have insurance, buy the drug at a discount, and then you sell it at its normal price, you get a huge government-guaranteed profit. And so obviously hospitals, recognizing this profit opportunity, there's a huge kind of arbitrage that they earn every time they sell the drug, legally, of course, within the program's regulations, but sell the drug to a covered patient. And so their incentive is to sell as many of those drugs as they possibly can to those covered patients. And that's where the kind of abuse of the program kind of starts from.
Wayne, I was really most troubled to learn that hospitals are setting up new facilities to serve just middle class and wealthy communities in order to maximize this profit motive. So how do hospitals and health providers justify this trend?
Well, I think when we start looking at these issues, it's really important to step back. The entire healthcare system is plagued with adverse incentives, and the hospitals and the health providers, they're trapped in this bad system, just as the patients are, doctors are, and the pharmacists are. Everyone's just trapped trapped in a bad system. Certainly there are many covered entities, and they're trying to expand their reach to vulnerable populations. That's why people go into the healthcare field to begin with, is they want to help people. But they also need to survive under these very difficult circumstances. And so I think when you look at those factors all around, and you look at hospitals trying to keep their heads above water, when you have an incentive to make the ends meet more easily, that's certainly going to be kind of something people are going to pursue. I mean, you can't expect people, give them an incentive to make a large amount of profit. You can't expect people won't follow those incentives. So I think the problems like this 340B problem are something that we should expect, and we constantly see from the broader healthcare system and the problems that plague that. And so what we really need to do is fundamentally reform our healthcare system.
Wayne, another unintended consequence that you describe in your study is the consolidation of health providers under 340B. How has this program led to the acquisition of the independent healthcare providers by larger hospitals?
Well, if we go back to the profit motive, right, you have typically a percentage discount of 20 to 50% off of the price of the drugs that a 340B entity can purchase compared to a non-340B entity. So if you have an independent healthcare provider, and a lot of the oncology centers are typically rife for this type of abuse, if you're not affiliated with a 340B center, you're purchasing your drug at the cost, and pricing of medicines is very complicated to begin with, but whatever that cost would be, that's what you're purchasing it for. If a 340B hospital purchases or merges or acquires that facility, all of a sudden an oncology center that was paying X dollars for their drugs, they can now buy that drug for 20-50% less. Well, that becomes again a way to make an institution significantly more profitable. And so that incentive, following that incentive, we've seen a tremendous amount of consolidation where facilities that were once kind of independent are now being kind of absorbed into these huge 340B entities.
Wayne, you make the case in your study that the 340B program is threatening the overall quality of the U.S. healthcare system. How so?
Well, the problem arises because Santa Claus, it's Christmas time, right? Santa Claus does not work in Washington, D.C. So when the government mandates that a product has to be sold at a discount to select groups, they can't make the costs of creating those products disappear. And so therefore, the costs are still there, and somebody has to bear that cost, right? We're not going to be sure who's going to bear it beforehand, but we know for a fact that somebody will. So if we look at 340B, perhaps it's the drug manufacturers and they're losing money, or perhaps it's non-340B patients where their drug prices are now higher because there's a transfer of costs from 340B to non-340B patients. So the point is that 340B is creating costs, and somebody is bearing those costs, and those costs reduce overall health quality. Then if you think about what we were just talking about in terms of consolidation, there are many people who, for whatever reason, might prefer or might be better served in an independent kind of center as opposed to a center that's affiliated with a hospital. For those people, when you have this incentive to get a consolidation, so you have these independent centers no longer existing, that can impact people's quality of care. And again, that's, when you have consolidation because you're serving patients better, that's a good thing. When we have consolidation simply to take advantage of a government-created profit opportunity, that's when you can have instances where your quality of healthcare is going to be declining. And that's a real concern.
So reforming the 340B program has been the subject of considerable debate in Washington in recent months. The Trump administration recently announced their proposal to reform the program. What specifically has the administration proposed to try and reform the system, and what are your thoughts on their proposals?
I think the key reforms which are being pushed, and is very important, is to bring the program back kind of to its intended constituents and its intended purpose when it was actually implemented in 1992. I mean, I think that needs to be a bare minimum reform that we need to look at. So if you look at the evolution of this program, in around 2010, with the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, right, Obamacare, and with some changes that the regulator made in terms of how outside pharmacies, what's called contract pharmacies, work with the hospitals and the other federal covered entities, that's really helped this explosion of the program. So now you have contract pharmacies pharmacies, which it used to be if you had a hospital or some sort of federal healthcare center that didn't have an in-house pharmacy, you were allowed to have one outside pharmacy to give the drugs. Now, anyone or any organization can have an outside pharmacy, and they can have lots of them. So you see this growth of contract pharmacies spreading out, and that's really brought in the ability for one, more abuse because there's less oversight, it's more complicated, and you also have this expansion to areas where you have fewer of the intended population. And some of the problems we were talking about earlier are put on steroids, if you could say, based on contract pharmacies. So the reforms that are really necessary is to bring the contract pharmacies back to its original intent. So you can only have one outside pharmacy if you don't have an internal pharmacy within the hospital. And the same thing in terms of the population, trying to get the discount, making sure that discount gets to the patients. So the patients are spending less for their drugs, not that it's a profit mechanism for the hospital or other covered entity. So these types of reforms that actually get the benefit to the people it's intending, at a bare minimum, that's what the program's intention is. The government program should at least hit that benchmark.
Well, Wayne, if you were made king for a day, what specific changes would you propose to ensure that the poorest Americans are receiving access to affordable, life-saving medications as originally intended under the 340B program?
So I can only be king of the day, but only address 340B, nothing else, huh? I think we go back to what we were just talking about, that I think the most important thing, if I can only do one thing in terms of 340B, it would be reforms, especially on the abuse front, and to make sure that the discount, if there's a 20 to 50% discount on that medicine, then if you have an uninsured person, that intended population, that they should get that 50% discount on the drug. Often, like I was talking about contract pharmacies a moment ago, often the contract pharmacy kind of arrangement, it makes it difficult to know who is actually the eligible population. And so you have this intended population with the pharmacy and the covered entity, they purchased the drug, let's say at a 50% discount, but the actual patient, they didn't pay any discounted price. And so if I was a king of the day, I would want to make sure that patient gets the discount, because that's the purpose of the program, is to help those patients.
So Wayne, in Washington, Congress has got a lot on its plate now. What do you think is the future of 340B program? Do you think we'll get reforms?
I think we will. I think there's a lot of movement out there. There's a lot of interest in, and I think it's actually something that could be bipartisan, where the program has expanded too much. It's become too much of a regulatory burden on the industry. So I think you can, and the population that's supposed to be helping isn't being helped. So I think there's a real opportunity from both the left and from the right to come together and reform this program to get back to its roots, where it's just a targeted population that needs this assistance, that it's just getting that assistance there. And then, as some of the Inspector General reports have put out there, put some much more effective controls on the program so we can be ensured it's achieving those objectives. That's something I see. There's movement out there, and there's certainly a bipartisan path for it to be achieved. So I'm hopeful we'll actually get some important reforms to the program.
Well, Wayne, for our listeners who are interested in reading your study, how can they get a copy?
Well, they should definitely be going to pacificresearch.org and checking out the studies on 340B, as well as all the other great stuff that we're doing.
Thanks very much, Wayne.
Thank you.
Thanks again to our guest, Wayne Winegarden, and to my colleague, Tim Anaya. To download his brief, go to our website at pacificresearch.org. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/PacificResearch1. That's the number 1. Also, check out our blog, Right by the Bay, on our website at pacificresearch.org. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. We hope you'll come back again for another episode of PRI's podcast.